Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. Government cybersecurity agency CERT this week reported New Zealanders lost $8.9 million to cyber scams in the September quarter, the biggest quarterly losses since CERT started tracking this data in 2017. Also this week, there were reports of several cyber attacks on New Zealand companies, including health insurer Acuro, Mercury IT, Ministry of Justice, New Zealand Nurses Organisation, Physiotherapy Board of New Zealand, plus business lobby groups, Business New Zealand, the Wellington Chamber of Commerce and Business Central. The Reserve Bank's annual stress tests of the banks it regulates this year included cyber attacks for the first time, as Ross McEwen, the New Zealander who is the CEO of BNZ's parent National Australia Bank, said the group faces more than 50,000 cyber attack attempts a month. So just how concerned should we be about the threat from cyber criminals and hackers? To discuss this, I'm joined by Adam Boileau, Executive Director of Security, Testing and Assurance at cybersecurity provider CyberCX. Hi Adam, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast.
Hi Gareth, thanks for having me.
Look, just to kick us off, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do yourself?
I guess I'm a professional hacker. For the last 15, 20 years or so, I've been working in what has become this computer security industry, although it wasn't really that when I started. And I lead out the security testing assurance team at CyberCX New Zealand, which in country is about 40 or so people who break into things for a living. We get retained by, banks and government entities and corporations to break into their systems, write a report about how we did it, explain what they could do better, and kind of really help tie together the practical realities of computer systems with business risk management. Like, we're trying to make risk management choices. You have to have good information about how likely a bad thing is to happen, what the impact of it is. And our job fundamentally is to look at the empirical reality of the technical systems, like what they actually do, rather than what the person who sold it to you said, or what the designer meant it to do, or what the programmer who wrote it thinks it does, but what it actually does. So in that respect, it's a combination of technical hacking, like a computer hacker would do, plus, hopefully a little bit of business acumen and some ability to explain those risks, contextualize them, understand them, and then give them to, businesses in ways that they can then use to make, good quality decisions about risk. So that's kind of what we do. And I've been doing, in this role for almost 15 years. CyberCX bought the company that I was previously involved with, Insomnia Security. And so, I've been, same set of skills as a hacker, slightly different motivations.
Great. Well, look, that sounds like a great context in which to enlighten us as to what's going on in this world. So, look, as things stand today in New Zealand from a cyber security perspective, just how challenging are things, I guess, for individuals and businesses? And are they getting worse?
It's pretty clear that things are getting worse. For most people, their exposure to cybersecurity now really is only the result of headlines. Before, if you ask someone about computer hacking 10 years ago, they probably would have thought about movie hacking, the 1980s movie, The War Games, where Matthew Broderick breaks into the, American missile defense system and accidentally starts a nuclear war. That's kind of what people imagined. And hacking wasn't a thing that really affected individuals or businesses, enterprises, until relatively recently. Most people have received, spam emails or, Nigerian prince scams, romance scams, things that might kind of trick you out of your money. But the computer security world really has changed in the last 5-10 years with the introduction of a business model that actually supports doing computer crime. Previously in the, 80s and 90s, it was mostly just kids having fun, and there was no real impact from your computers not being secure. And, all of the computer systems that we've built, since the beginning of the Cold War have basically all been complete trash from a security perspective, but it never mattered until very, very recently. And now that, Russian, Eastern European criminal, organized crime and criminal gangs can make very, very real money in the order of billions out of computer crime, that's just changed the whole landscape for what matters and the things that we kind of have to worry about. And so all of the computer security systems, antivirus systems and firewalls and things that the computer security industry sold to people through the early 2000s, none of it really worked and none of it really mattered because there was no real crime. I mean, the only other use for hacking was nation-state intelligence. And to this day, like if a foreign government with a well-funded intelligence agency wants to get into your computers, they can and they will and they do. And there's not really a whole bunch, unless you're in an industry where defending against a nation-state attacker is critical to you. So I'm thinking, power generation, telecommunications, banking. Then, there's not, it's kind of not a whole bunch you can do about that. But the world just has changed. And, that's a function of geopolitics almost more than anything else. I mean, the fact that Russia won't extradite criminals has made it a viable thing to do. And in Nigeria, when those kind of Nigerian prince scams kicked off, for a while, it was the done thing to do, right? It was seen as a reasonable way to make money because, global inequality meant that, the West was seen as a fair game target. Our colonial past, our manipulation of, international bodies like the International Monetary Fund and so on, kind of made us fair game for a developing country. And so the world around us has shaped how computer security has now all of a sudden kind of become relevant to individual people and to businesses, to enterprises, to government.
Okay, yeah, it's a very good context. Just in terms of, I guess, some of the trends you're seeing at the moment and the key methods that cyber criminals are using at the moment, could you give us a few examples on that?
So depending on what you're trying to achieve, like if you're trying to steal money, then there's a number of great avenues. Obviously, the rise of cryptocurrency has given criminals a way to move money around that's, relatively straightforward, although it's becoming less so as regulators and police forces are becoming better at investigating how cryptocurrency moves around. But before we had cryptocurrency, money muling via Western Union was still a thing that, and still is a relevant thing that happens, or through bank transfers and those kinds of things, and having, physical people mule money around. So if you want to make money, then getting into somewhere where you can get money out. And the two most common from a, financial crime perspective are now ransomware and business email compromise. The ransomware is when you break in, you steal someone's data, encrypt it all maybe, and then try and, get a ransom or an extortion payment to either release that data if it's been encrypted, or to not release it if you've stolen it and are using it for extortion, which is what we see for most modern ransomware, is that they do both of those things. And then the second one is business email compromise, where someone breaks into your email account as a business, usually through guessing a password or sending you an email that encourages you to give them the password or give them access to your email account somehow, and then using the trust inherent in your email account to cause other people to pay money. And a great example of that is, say, real estate transfers. When you're settling a real estate deal and there's a very large amount of money that needs to go into some account, if you can break into a realtor or a lawyer or whoever's email and then kind of change the bank account details on an outgoing email, then you're going to make off with a lot of money. And we see that in, invoice fraud, where people send invoices, that claim to be from a particular company but have a different destination address, that kind of thing. So from a financial point of view, those are the two kind of main entry points. And ransomware and business email compromise really are just, that's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And then when we get into more technical sorts of attacks, and some ransomware crews will use technical attacks against, if you've got services from your enterprise exposed on the internet, if you've got remote access, via a virtual private network, or you've got some other mechanism of logging into your environment where there's technical flaws in the equipment or software from the vendors you've bought, then those provide an entry point for people to, get in and then carry out whatever other thing they are trying to do.
So as I mentioned at the start, there's been a few cyber attack stories in the media in New Zealand this week. But look, more broadly, we had the Waikato District Health Board situation last year. Kiwi Bank and some other corporates came under attack. The Reserve Bank was targeted, I think, in summer 2020 with a file sharing system hacked, which was quite an interesting one. But look, internationally, this is going on all the time as well. I'm just wondering, probably most of the listeners will have heard of some of the high-profile international and local cases, but there are a couple of sort of narrow escapes, I guess, where calamity was narrowly avoided. that you could sort of share that might be of interest to us?
It's a great question. So one of the hard things about this industry and this, kind of the cybersecurity world is people generally don't talk about bad things happening to them, to their business. I mean, when it's externally visible, like, New Zealand Stock Exchange getting attacked, through denial of service where their websites were unavailable, or something like Waikato District Health Board where, it's become quite public. We can see those, but there's so many that happen without any real discussion. And obviously, it's the job of the regulator in many respects to, encourage organizations to report when they've been attacked. In the United States, we see lots of examples where the SEC, are requiring publicly traded organizations to disclose within a certain time frame when a bad thing has happened to them, whether they've lost data, whether they've been breached. And some of those requirements are quite hard because you don't really know what's happened until, within a few days, you may not necessarily understand what the situation is. And so situations where people have been breached or been attacked and then had it not go horribly wrong for them, sometimes you hear about those because people want to tell that good story, but the size and scale of what's happening is still not super clear. But I mean, really where we see people having a positive or at least a not catastrophic outcome, and I guess anything not catastrophic for a business is probably positive at the point you're being extorted, is where you can and you have drilled and exercised how to respond to one of these incidents. And you look at many businesses' disaster recovery plans or planning, and you'd expend a bunch of effort for what happens if our factory catches fire, or what happens if our data center where our computers are catches fire, but maybe less so in the cloud era. But ransomware is probably a much more common thing to have had to go through. And so having a response plan, having, knowing what your comms are going to look like to your customers, knowing, what it's going to look like to the market or the regulators or to whoever else you have to inform and work with. Organizations that don't have catastrophe tend to be the ones that have done that process first so that it's not so panic. Because many businesses, it's just going to be straight up panic stations. And if you can't get access to your email or to your files and coordinate, then everything just kind of goes off the rails very early. So the organizations that handle it the best are the ones that can turn around and say to the scammers or the people who've taken their data in a ransomware situation and say, actually, we know what data you've got. We know the impact if it gets leaked or sold on the dark net or whatever else, and we're okay with that. We've got other controls, we've got other things in place. And being able to just turn around and tell someone who's trying to extort you to piss off, that feels good. And that's really the situation you want to be in. And much like, almost anything in computer security, these are the results of human mistakes usually. And we all need to plan for our own inevitable failures. Like, we're always going to make a mistake. You're always going to be, feeling crummy and have a headache and fall for a scam email or something like that. And one of the bits of advice I give to people is really, like, if you can accidentally paste your password into Facebook and not have it be a terrible day, like just go, okay, I better change my password, but that didn't result in catastrophic enterprise compromise, then you've done well. And that's, organizations that succeed or have a good story to tell at the end of it tend to be the ones that have done the prep work. Although there are examples of cases where, just pure luck has meant that people have survived. I mean, the shipping company Maersk, that was kind of collateral damage in an attack by the Russian government on Ukrainian civil society. They ended up having a global outage of their computer systems, and it turned out that one critical replica of their Windows Active Directory domain controller, so the thing that does authentication for all of their networks that's replicated around the world, it turned out that one office in Africa somewhere happened to be offline at that point because the local internet was down, and so that replica of the critical piece of software didn't get destroyed, and they were able to go someone flew to Africa, got the box, flew it back to London, they restored it, and then were able to kind of bootstrap from there all the way back up to bringing everything back to life. And that's you don't want to be reliant on that kind of luck.
No, indeed not. Look, you talked a little bit in one of your earlier answers about some of the people behind, I guess, the cybercrime and the fact that it's a career. It's become a career for people. I'm just wondering, can you enlighten us a little bit more in terms of who are these people, who are these cyber criminals, hackers, etc. And I mean, the obvious thing they want is money on many occasions, but obviously there are others where there are other things that they might want. So can you just tell us a little bit about who's behind all this and what else they might want apart from money?
Well, I mean, I guess the people behind are as diverse as any other group in society, right? There's always a huge variety of motivations and people, but in terms of the actual financially motivated cybercrime, what we tend to see is that there is a lot of it out of Eastern Europe and Russia, ex-Soviet states. And, part of the reason for that is those are places where there was pretty good quality education, like technical education, technical colleges and universities, access to computers. That was a pretty, they had good education and good access to technology, but not a whole lot of opportunity. And then when the Soviet Union kind of split apart, the Iron Curtain fell, and, we saw a lot of the early work in computer viruses, for example, in the 80s and 90s came out of like Bulgaria, because great opportunity, like great technical, education, not much opportunity. And it was kind of a way to make your name for yourself. And similarly now, with Russia being a bit of a global pariah and not having, not extraditing its own citizens, plus the level of corruption, and all of the, kind of madness, once it became Russian Federation in terms of, of corruption and, criminal oligarchs and so on and so forth. Like it really was a very dog-eat-dog world, and you had to scrabble to make a living, and going into crime, ripping off Westerners, paying off the local police so that it wasn't a problem. Like that was how you made ends meet. And it just has burgeoned into, a real ecosystem there. We did see a bit of a breakdown of that now that the conflict with Ukraine has kicked off, because many of these cybercrime groups were Russian speaking, but not necessarily all Russians. There's quite a lot of Ukrainian cyber criminals. And those networks, necessarily, you don't know who the people you're dealing with. You're dealing with pseudonyms or, names on hacking forums or whatever else. And so many of them didn't know who was Ukrainian, who was Russian. And we actually saw a bunch of infighting and, people releasing, chat logs and access to technical systems inside cybercrime groups because it was Russians versus Ukrainians during the early part of that conflict. And so, you can kind of understand that, right? If you're in Russia and everyone's on the grift, and in Russia, if you don't target Russians or Russian entities or Russian people, then it's kind of okay. There's no real consequences to you. We've seen plenty of examples of crime software, malware, that will check if your keyboard layout is Russian. And if it's like, if you've got a Cyrillic keyboard layout, then it won't trigger. And that's a way to make sure you don't, you don't end up getting, breaking the unwritten rules of targeting where you live. But then there's also, plenty of examples of, for example, in Africa, the classic Nigerian scams, although obviously that's not just Nigeria, in India, there's a great tech industry, and there's also a bunch of, like all the infrastructure and staffing and training for, say, running a call center for an offshore business also is perfectly great for running a scam call center. And so we see, the sorts of things that phone up and say, hey, I'm from Microsoft and I need to fix your computer. A lot of those are Indian call centers. We've seen Indian hacker for hire operations where they will sell services to private investigators and, businessmen who want to get, competitive intelligence on people they're doing business with. And that's a thing we've seen blow up pretty spectacularly over the last year or so, as a bunch of those Indian hacker for hire firms have been involved in, big lawsuits and things going wrong for them. And then say there's China, where there's a big, obviously a massive tech industry, a whole bunch of, very, very smart programmers and network engineers and great skills. And the Chinese government is willing to leverage them for its own benefit. So we see when Chinese state intelligence wants to go, say, break into Lockheed Martin and steal secrets about jets, they'll get some local, hacker crew to do it. But that same hacker crew you will also see doing cryptocurrency scamming or stealing. We saw a report recently that one of the main Chinese, kind of intelligence-directed hacker crews had also stolen like $20 million worth of US COVID unemployment funds just while they were there to pay the bills. And so sometimes there is a nexus between state-directed, state-sponsored, state-tolerated, but also crime. And at that point, if you're North Korea and you're funding, your entire weapons program with stolen cryptocurrency and NFTs, that's your patriotic duty. And if you don't, you're going to get, probably get shot. So there's just a whole variety of motivations, a whole variety of sets of experience. When we see, even countries like, say, Vietnam, for example, they have a very, great set of skills. And we've seen them, for example, going after vehicle manufacturers, because Vietnam, strategic priority for Vietnam is building domestic vehicle manufacturing so they can compete with, other regions as a manufacturing, economy. And they'll go break into Toyota, for example, to go and make sure they've got all the data they need to compete effectively. So there's just so many, reasons that you might be doing this stuff. There's so many, the skills are very transferable, super lucrative, easily learned. It's not that complicated being a computer hacker, but when you look at it from a business perspective, you don't know who's attacking you. You don't necessarily know what they want or why they're there. And understanding those things can be really helpful, because as the classic joke goes, right, you only have to run faster than the next guy to get away from the bear. And there's a degree of that kind of dog-eat-dog in the cyber world. The head of the British intelligence agency, the GCHQ, at one point said, it sounds harsh, but the only thing we have to do is be better than France.
Right. We hear a lot about the dark web. Now, I'm just wondering if you can give us a brief explanation of what this actually is. And if my credit card data, for example, got stolen and the thief wanted to sell it, would it end up on the dark web?
The dark web's kind of a nebulous, doesn't really mean a lot concept. It just kind of covers a whole bunch of things. The general intent of the term is to mean things that are not immediately obvious if you just go type them into Google, right? That there is another layer of internet that doesn't necessarily get indexed by Google or other search engines, and that you have to have a little bit of understanding to get into. Quite often what we would consider the dark web is just a bunch of internet forums that you have to kind of have a relationship to get into, like a members only club kind of thing. And that can be, you have to speak good Russian, or someone has to vouch for you, or you have to kind of post a bond that, for your own good behavior or whatever else. There is also a thing called Tor, the onion router, which is a kind of area of the internet that you access through a particular piece of software that occludes where you are coming from and where you are going to. It was originally developed by the US Navy, and that allows you to have, services that law enforcement would like to shut down, but not, and then obscure where they actually are. And the classic example for that was underground drug markets, like the Silk Road before it disappeared, and all of its kind of successors, where if you wanted to buy drugs on the internet, then you would have to download a particular piece of software to be able to get to this website. And it's just another website, but you get to it in a mechanism that obscures where it actually physically is in the world, so they can't go and get law enforcement, to go seize the physical servers and investigate them. So the dark web kind of covers a gamut of ways that people share information and sell information and buy drugs or guns or whatever else in a way that is as safe as they can manage it. And there's a bunch of technical mechanisms that happen, but it isn't like a one thing. It's just a nebulous concept.
Across the Tasman in Australia in recent months, there have been a couple of high-profile corporate attacks. So I'm thinking here Optus and Medibank. And Australia's obviously got a relatively newish government with the Labor government there, and they have a Minister of Cybersecurity, Claire O'Neill. This is really interesting. She's been talking very tough and talking about offensively going to find these people, hunt them down and debilitate them before they can attack our country. If people come after our citizens, we are going to go after them, this type of stuff. So I'm really interested in this approach. One, having a Minister of Cybersecurity, and two, this sort of offensive capability to hit back. I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. First of all, what can you do to hit back? And is this a path that perhaps New Zealand should look at following?
So we've talked a lot over the years about whether we should use military or intelligence capabilities like, the sorts of technical capabilities that the Australian Signals Directorate has, the NSA, the GCSB here in New Zealand, whether we should be using those against cybercrime. And obviously cybercrime at a scale where it actually bubbled to the surface enough to matter is really a pretty new development. And historically, we would say the right way to deal with this is through law enforcement, that this is a problem for law enforcement. And we've dealt with transnational crime. We've dealt with, we have mutual legal assistance arrangements. We have organizations like Interpol. It's not a new thing to deal with how we follow organized crime, follow their money around the world. But the effectiveness of a traditional law enforcement approach against cybercrime has been pretty limited. There was obviously a learning curve that law enforcement agencies went through to understand what the crimes were, how computers worked, how you investigate them, what that looks like. And that took a while, and that is the right approach. But it has not been effective. And there's a bunch of complexities in the law enforcement approach, especially in the West where we care about, warrants and due process and so forth. We saw earlier on in the FBI's investigation of internet crimes, when they're trying to figure out when people are using technologies to hide who they are and where they're from. One of the tricks that they did was, if they know how to break into your computer, say you use a web browser to connect to some crime service, if the FBI can take over that crime service and then use that position to attack back to your web browser, take it over, figure out where you are, who you are, and identify you, then that would let them investigate. But when the FBI went to do that and went to get a warrant, the court would quite rightly ask, well, who are you, in what jurisdiction are the people you're going to break into, and do you have jurisdiction to do that? And if you don't know where they are in the world or in the United States or wherever, then it's very hard to get a warrant. And so that process and all of the kind of checks and balances we have around law enforcement made it a difficult thing to investigate. And, they still have avenues. They've still successfully prosecuted cybercrime. But it's just very difficult. You even look at for a local example, when there was a hacker, Rorschach, that stole a bunch of documents from Cameron Slater, the whale oil blogger, which had a bunch of dirt on the National Party. Where Rorschach, the hacker, gave that data to author Nikki Hager, who wrote a book before 2 or 3 elections ago now, and the police investigated and ultimately came up with nothing because they couldn't circumvent, or they didn't have enough evidence to figure out who did it or how, or so on and so forth. And so law enforcement has not been super well equipped traditionally. Plus, then there's all of the transnational aspects of, Russia won't extradite its own citizens, et cetera, et cetera. So when ransomware was small or cybercrime was small, okay, fair enough. But when we're talking about, Waikato Hospital being turned off, or if in the United States, entire oil and gas pipelines being turned off, at that point it starts becoming nationally significant, right? It's the job of the government to keep its citizens safe from international aggression or whatever else. And at that point, you start to ask, if we've got a team of gung-ho hackers that we've built and developed and spent all this money on, and we've got a problem that involves computer hacking, why don't we use the right tool for the job? And that's, obviously there's always been checks and balances around intelligence agencies and how we use them. So GCSB, for example, is not mandated to operate domestically, to attack people, right? That's the job of the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service with its counterintelligence role. And so those structures that were designed to prevent abuse of those things do get in the way a little bit. And Australia, if you ask the NSA to do this in the US, it's a bit, they have a bunch of constraints that perhaps the Australian Signals Directorate don't. And so we're all very interested to see what standing up, in the case of Australia, standing up a task force of 100 or so people with a blend of hackers from the Australian Signals Directorate, law enforcement from the Australian Federal Police, and giving them the mandate to just make this problem less bad through whatever means necessary. And they've got a bunch of really great ways to do that. It's not ideal, but it's a pragmatic answer to a very real problem. And we're all very interested to see how it goes, because this is not a thing we've seen done around the rest of the, the Five Eyes of the kind of, Western liberal democracies. This is not an approach we've seen really done at scale and with the kind of political leadership and capital put into it the Australians have. So it's going to be very interesting. And it's not necessarily a case of, putting commandos into St. Petersburg to throw somebody off a bridge, right? It's getting into people's computers, making them aware that they've been identified, disrupting the trust that those kind of crime ecosystems require to operate, stealing their Bitcoins, or whatever else that can be done to just kind of disrupt and degrade. And, New Zealand, whilst we the GCSB does have a bunch of great hackers, and we could do it in the context of, say, the overall Five Eyes. We do compartmentalize up the work, right? Share it around. What's the point of being an alliance if everyone has to do everything? So I think we're all looking at Australia. We're going to see how it goes. And, Claire O'Neill obviously has, come out swinging politically, and she wouldn't be doing that if she wasn't particularly confident that the Australian Signals Directorate could deliver on that, right? If you're a politician, you go out and say something bold like that, like you don't do that without having talked to someone first. And maybe I'm being naive about how politicians work, but yeah, I feel like they must have had some successes already. So I think it's a really interesting approach, and I'm curious to see how well it goes.
So, I mean, do you think it would be good for New Zealand to have a Minister of Cybersecurity? And obviously yourself and many others will be watching this Australian approach very closely, and perhaps we should be looking to follow suit if indeed they have some success.
Yes, I think there is a place for a Minister of Cybersecurity in New Zealand, and I think probably in almost any country at this point, because computers are so important to everything now. Like everything is a computer. Our society runs on computers, on digital transaction systems, on communication systems, global positioning systems, and this is no longer a thing for nerds, right? This is a thing that impacts every area of society, supply chains for food, for fuel, for, how we run elections. I mean, if we're going to push for, online elections or internet voting or whatever, like that's not a thing that we can just let nerds deal with. That's the thing that requires a whole society approach. It requires leadership. It requires a bunch of discussion and hard choices. And it's kind of not really enough to just bolt that into the side of Department of Internal Affairs or Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, or let the Bureau do things, when, their mission and their level of kind of classification makes it hard to share and have conversations with them. So, there's a whole bunch of functions around the New Zealand government that deal with computer security things, like set standards, set, requirements for suppliers to government and to, the business, the Reserve Bank, how they, look after the requirements for banking and resilience in banking. Those things all matter, but they kind of need to be managed cohesively. And I feel like that's there is room for a minister responsible for that. Because, if global positioning stopped working, or if the undersea fiber optic cables to the United States and Australia were, someone put a boat anchor through them, like that's just as damaging to the New Zealand economy as people bringing in, kiwi fruit fungus or the sorts of controls we put in place on the border to bring in, animals and food products to protect our agriculture. The computer stuff is becoming that important. And, I'm sure there's some farmers that would argue that point, and perhaps quite rightly. But, this stuff is just really important. And I feel like we need that leadership, and the free market doesn't deal well with these, with the sorts of risk management that you need to do with cybersecurity. Like if you're buying, if you go down to the local computer store to buy a security camera for your house, you don't make a purchasing decision based on security. You're going to make it based on price, maybe based on color, maybe based on how how convenient it is to install in your house. You're not going to be considering, is this made by Hikvision, that are answerable to the Chinese Communist Party, that the UK and the US just decided you're no longer going to be able to buy, or that in the UK you're not allowed to use in government agencies. But you don't make a decision based on that. And so the ability of the market to moderate and apply the free hand to create security outcomes doesn't really work well. And that makes it the job of a regulator or a government. And the government leading by example, how it deals with its suppliers, how it deals with how it procures equipment and all the concerns it has, that will then push the rest of the market along. And we're seeing that happening in the United States now. They're starting to push down requirements on suppliers to the US government. And because many of those suppliers are suppliers to everybody else, like Microsoft and Oracle and other big software vendors, then that will trickle down to everybody else. And that's a good outcome. So I feel the government really does have a leadership role as well as a regulatory role to make the market operate like it should, but does not.
You've really outlined a widespread international problem in what you've said today. So, I mean, obviously, when you've got regimes who, as you say, basically will turn a blind eye to their citizens committing cybercrime against overseas interests, it's pretty challenging to combat. So I'm just wondering, is this a war? And also, In terms of international coordination, cooperation, from a New Zealand perspective, is Five Eyes the best sort of option there, or are there other things we could be looking at, or perhaps we even are looking at to help coordinate an international response?
I mean, war is a strong word. What I do think is that the path towards globalization has kind of stalled, right? We imagined 10, 15 years ago that, you looked at the success of the European Union, right, of putting aside historical grievances, of forming together an economic bloc and free trade and free travel and coordinated regulation, that's kind of the model that we imagined the whole world would get to, right? We signed a free trade treaty with China because we kind of imagined that, globalization, globalized logistics, just in time, kind of supply chain, all of the world working together for economic benefit was what the future would look like. And I think it's fair to say that vision is crumbling a little bit, right? We, are settling down into a, kind of Western liberal democratic free market bloc and China bloc. And that changes a bunch of assumptions. I mean, certainly in terms of supply chains and how we procure services and equipment across national boundaries. That is starting to change a bit because we're seeing the positions that say put China in start to be leveraged for their benefit rather than necessarily mutual benefit for everybody. And the assumption that we would have globally interoperable computers and globally, like, we would all use Microsoft Word wherever you were in the world. And, that vision of being able to pick up a phone and call any number anywhere in the world and have it just work because we use the same phone systems and standardization and so on, that vision, I don't know how long that's going to hold. Like, if you're Russia right now and you run your power stations on Microsoft Windows, that's American software. Microsoft's ultimately answerable to the American government because that's where they live. And we may not want to admit it, but if a war like a proper World War III kicked off, what would be off the table? Would Microsoft being told by the US government, you can't ship security updates to Russia? We've already had that conversation. And if you're Russia right now, you're thinking we need to diversify how we write our software, where it comes from, where we buy the computers from, much like when the Five Eyes, US, and then eventually Australia and us and the UK pushed back against Huawei, the Chinese telecoms manufacturer, being involved in setting standards for 5G mobile networks and deploying the core of mobile networks. We pushed back on that for national security reasons, for sovereignty reasons, and ultimately, geopolitical conflict. We look at the constraints the US government has put on semiconductor manufacturing equipment being sold to China very recently because Taiwan is the center of global semiconductor manufacturing, and China's military is gearing up and stated ambition of taking Taiwan back. And right now, if you want to buy a computer that's not made in Shenzhen, right, you're in a tough time, right? If you're the American government and you're trying to buy computers to, run the State Department on, they're probably going to come from China, which we are starting to realize that is a liability. And New Zealand's in a very strange position here because our geopolitical kind of position is Western liberal democracies, right? I mean, although we backed out of ANZUS and, we stood up against the United States in the 80s, most New Zealanders' understanding of our political closeness to America, and say the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance is a really great example of this because most New Zealanders did not realize that was a thing in the 90s. Right, most New Zealanders thought we told the Americans who was boss in the 80s, where they can't bring their nuclear ships in, and we set off on what to most New Zealanders felt like a more independent path. But in terms of the closeness of our governments and our intelligence agencies and things, that really wasn't the case. And so now we are in a position where our trade partner is China, but our defense partner is the US. And most New Zealanders don't think about the geopolitics. We're not raised with the kind of rah-rah, patriotism that you might get, saluting the flag every morning like you get in the United States. We don't really have that. And most New Zealanders, whether they're doing business, whether they're traveling, don't necessarily think twice about going to Hong Kong or to China or flying on China Southern Airlines it's not a thing we think about. And yet we are, the position of being majority trade with China, harmonizing our trade regulations. And John Key was, just recently quoted as, saying all this hostility towards China is bad for business and, but yet being tied to the Western democracies like we should, because we are a liberal Western democracy and we aspire to be one and be fair and so on. That's not a position that can continue forever. If China goes into Taiwan, we have to pick a side. And all of the things that means for Chinese-made equipment, Chinese-made cars, Chinese ownership of infrastructure projects, those things, that globalization we took for granted as being just how things would be post-World War II, I don't know that it's going to be like that. China is big enough to go it alone. Like, they've got enough population, they've got enough technical expertise to build their own software, to build their own computers, to develop their own military equipment. Very few other places do. Russia certainly doesn't. You look at the failure of their, equipment and supplies and infrastructure in Ukraine. We have to pick which side we're going to hook our wagon to, because we're too small to go it alone. And I don't know that I want to be the milk production canton of China. Much as I disagree with, Trump and crazy American Republican politics, it's still less bad than the alternatives. And I think that's, for New Zealanders, our government always talks trade. Our government never talks hard power, right? We don't see Jacinda trumpeting our military or trumpeting, the ways that we're combating, Chinese intelligence intrusion into New Zealand government entities. Right, we always talk about free trade, and the perception of us in the world doesn't match up with our geopolitical reality, and that correction, I think, is due.
Well, that's a fascinating point at which to end, I think, Adam, and a very interesting conversation. So that's Adam Boileau, the Executive Director of Security Testing and Assurance at cybersecurity provider CyberCX. Thanks a lot for your time, Adam.
Thanks very much for having me, Gareth.
I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.